The man you are looking at is Chris Watts. In August 2018, he stood on his own front porch and begged, on live television, for his family to come home. This was that family. His wife, Shanann. His daughters, Bella and Celeste. And a baby boy, on the way, who would never be born. Millions of people watched Chris Watts plead for their safe return. His voice trembled. His eyes searched the cameras. And almost no one watching knew the truth, that he already knew exactly where his wife and daughters were. Because he was the one who had taken them there. This is the story of the family next door. From the outside, the Watts family looked like a dream. On social media, their life seemed to glow, a young couple, 2 bright little girls, a comfortable house in a brand new neighborhood. Birthday parties. Beach trips. A pregnancy announcement. To the hundreds of people who followed along, it was the picture of modern American happiness. Shanann shared it all, the birthday cakes, the beach trips, the ordinary Tuesday nights at home. Thousands of strangers came to feel as though they knew the Watts family personally. And that sense of closeness, of a life lived openly for everyone to see, would later make the ending almost impossible for people to accept. Shanann Watts was the heart of that picture. Warm, driven, and fiercely devoted to her daughters, she had built a small online business and a following of friends who adored her. She shared the good days and the hard ones. She talked openly about her health struggles and her hopes for the future. And more than anything, she talked about how much she loved her family. She had waited and worked and hoped for this life, the marriage, the daughters, the little boy on the way. To the people closest to her, Shanann was warm, generous, and endlessly proud of the family she was building. She had no reason in the world to believe that anything was about to go wrong. Their world was Frederick, Colorado, a fast-growing suburb on the plains north of Denver. Wide skies, new subdivisions, quiet cul-de-sacs. The kind of place families move to precisely because it feels safe, ordinary, and far from anything bad. On a street called Saratoga Trail, in a development of nearly identical 2-story homes, the Watts family lived at number 2825. From the sidewalk, it looked like every other house on the block, a symbol of everything a young American family was supposed to want. Chris and Shanann had married in 2012. Together they had 2 little girls, Bella, 4, and Celeste, 3. And Shanann was pregnant again, expecting a son they had already decided to name Nico. For years, the neighbors saw only the surface, the waved hellos, the kids in the yard, the ordinary rhythms of a busy young family. Nobody looks too closely at the house that seems to have it all together. And nobody looked too closely at this one. Chris himself was the easygoing everyman. Quiet, polite, endlessly agreeable. He worked long hours as an operator for an oil and gas company, out among the tanks and wells that dot the Colorado plains. He coached, he grilled, he smiled in the photos. Neighbors and co-workers described him afterward the way people so often do in these cases: nice, normal, helpful, the last man on earth you would ever suspect of anything at all. That very ordinariness would become one of the most disturbing parts of the whole story. Because there was no obvious darkness to point to. No violent temper the neighbors whispered about. No history that screamed a warning. Just a quiet, pleasant man who mowed his lawn and went to work, which is exactly what would make what came next so hard for anyone to believe. But behind the glowing photos, the picture had been cracking for a long time. There had been money troubles for years, the weight of a big house, a growing family, and old debts that never quite went away. Bills piled up. The pressure never fully lifted. And by the summer of 2018, the marriage itself had grown tense and distant. The warmth in those early photos had cooled into something strained. To the outside world, nothing had changed. Inside, two people were quietly drifting apart. Shanann had begun to sense it too. She confided in friends that something felt wrong, that Chris had grown cold and withdrawn in a way she couldn't explain. She was worried about her marriage. She wanted to fix it. What she did not know was that, in her husband's mind, the marriage was already over, and that he had begun to plan an exit far more terrible than divorce. Then came the secret that would burn it all down. Chris had begun an affair with a coworker. And in his mind, that relationship became an escape hatch, a door out of the marriage, the debt, and the whole exhausting performance of the perfect life. He began, quietly, to imagine a different future. One without the mortgage, without the arguments, without the responsibilities that had come to feel like a cage. A lighter life. A new beginning. A version of himself unburdened by everything he had built. Most men in that position simply leave. They file the papers, they move out, they start again, however painful it is. But somewhere in Chris Watts, a far darker idea had taken root. Instead of walking away from his family, he began to see them as the obstacle standing between him and the life he wanted. In the middle of August 2018, Shanann flew to Arizona for a work trip. She was busy and upbeat, networking, planning for the baby, texting friends late into the night about the future she was so excited to build. She sent them updates, shared her plans, counted down the days until she would be home with her girls. Every message she sent pointed forward, toward the birth, toward the family reunion, toward the life she still believed was ahead of her. She had no idea what was waiting for her back home. In the days before she left, friends would later say, something about Chris had felt subtly off, colder, more distant. But nothing anyone could name. Nothing that looked, at the time, like a warning. Her flight home was delayed, and a colleague dropped her at the house in the small hours of Monday, August 13th, around 2 a.m. She walked into her own home, exhausted, pregnant, and glad to be back. It was the last time anyone but Chris Watts would ever see her alive. What happened inside that house before dawn, we will not describe. Out of respect for Shanann and her daughters, this video will not dwell on it. But by the time the sun rose over Frederick, the mother and both little girls were gone. And the man left standing in that quiet home did not fall apart. He did not call for help. He did not dial 911. Instead, he began, almost at once, to build a lie. Moving with a cold, methodical calm that investigators would later find almost impossible to comprehend. He cleaned. He covered. He prepared his story. And in the hours and days that followed, he would send messages and make calls as though his wife and daughters were simply missing, as though he were as frightened and confused as everyone else. It was a performance he kept up, without cracking, far longer than most people ever could. Rather than call anyone, Chris Watts loaded his work truck and drove out of the sleeping neighborhood. He headed northeast, out onto the open plains, toward a remote oil work site he knew intimately from his job, roughly 40 miles from the house, far from any road where anyone would ever think to look. Out there, among the storage tanks and machinery, in a place most people would never even notice as they drove past, he tried to make his family disappear. It was calculated. It was patient. And it relied on the one thing he understood better than anyone, the quiet, forgotten corners of the oil fields where he worked. Then he climbed back into his truck, and he drove to his job. He clocked in. He moved through his shift. He answered messages. To the people around him that morning, Chris Watts was just another operator, doing another ordinary day of work, as if nothing at all had happened. Back in Frederick, the alarm was already rising. Shanann's close friend, Nicole, had been expecting her that morning. When Shanann missed an important medical appointment and suddenly stopped answering her phone, something she simply never did, Nicole's worry sharpened into real fear. She knew her friend. She knew that a pregnant Shanann, devoted to her daughters, would never simply vanish and go silent. Every instinct told her that something was badly wrong. And it was that refusal to be reassured, that stubborn, loving persistence, that would set everything in motion. She drove to the house on Saratoga Trail and knocked. No answer. But Shanann's car was in the garage. Her shoes were still inside. Her phone was in the house. Every single detail was wrong. So Nicole did the thing that would begin to unravel everything. She called the police. That afternoon, officers arrived for a welfare check. And Chris Watts met them at his own front door, calm, cooperative, and seemingly bewildered about where his family could possibly have gone. He let them in. He walked them through the rooms. He answered every question with the easy manner of an innocent man. But there was one detail he could not talk his way past. A neighbor's home security camera, pointed at the street, had quietly recorded his truck that morning, backed up to the house in the pre-dawn dark, during the very hours he could not explain. It was a small thing. And it would help bring the whole story down. As the story spread, the local news arrived on Saratoga Trail. And Chris Watts did something that would later feel almost unbearable to watch. He stood on his own doorstep, in front of the cameras, and pleaded for his wife and daughters to come home. His voice shook. He said he missed them. He said he needed them back, safe, in his arms. He described his daughters by name, his pregnant wife, the empty house. And millions of people would eventually watch that footage. Knowing what we now know, every second of it is chilling. Because as he stood there, trembling, pleading, playing the frightened husband for a national audience, Chris Watts already knew, with perfect and total certainty, that his family was never coming home. He had made sure of it himself, only hours before, out on the plains. But the mask had cracks. The investigators watching him closely began to notice things that did not fit. His grief seemed strangely flat. His answers came a little too smoothly. There were small, wordless tells, the kind that quietly separate real anguish from a performance. Within a day, quiet suspicion had settled on the husband who kept saying all the right words. They asked him to take a polygraph. He agreed. He failed. And as the pressure in that interrogation room began to build, the other life he had been hiding finally came into the light. The affair. The secret plans. The man who had quietly wanted out. Piece by piece, the story of the devoted, desperate husband collapsed. The performance could not survive contact with the evidence. And when he was finally confronted with the truth, Chris Watts began, at last, to talk. His first version was another lie, a desperate, cowardly attempt to shift the blame onto Shanann, to cast himself as anything other than what he was. But that lie fell apart almost as fast as he told it. And what remained underneath it was a truth almost too heavy to say out loud. On August 16, Chris Watts led investigators out onto the plains, to the remote oil site, and showed them what he had done. Whatever faint hope the search had still been holding on to ended there, in the dust and the tanks, under the wide, indifferent Colorado sky. The nation recoiled. The story ricocheted around the world within hours, not only because of its horror, but because of the sheer, smiling ordinariness of the man at its center. The glowing family photos. The nice guy from the oil fields. The husband who cried on camera. All of it, now, a mask over something no one had seen. People could not stop asking the same impossible question. How? How does a man do this to the people he is supposed to love most in the world, and then walk out onto his lawn and beg a television camera to help him find them. It was a crime that felt, somehow, both utterly alien and terrifyingly close to home. But headlines and sentences are not the real story. The real story is these four people. A mother named Shanann, who loved her daughters more than her own life. Two little girls, Bella and Celeste, full of laughter on a sunlit porch. And a baby boy, Nico, who never got the chance to be born. For lives, inside one ordinary home, erased by the one person on earth who was supposed to protect them all. There would be no long, uncertain trial. In November 2018, to avoid the possibility of a death sentence, Chris Watts pleaded guilty. He stood in a Colorado courtroom, in front of the family he had shattered, and admitted to taking the lives of his wife, his two daughters, and his unborn son. There was no dramatic courtroom battle, no last-minute defense, no final twist. Just a quiet, devastating admission of guilt that closed the case almost as suddenly as it had opened. For the family in that courtroom, there would be no comfort in it, only the unbearable confirmation of what they had already been forced to accept. The judge sentenced him to 5 life terms in prison, most of them to be served one after another, with no possibility of parole. He was transferred out of state, to a prison far from Colorado, to spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. He will never walk free again. For Shanann's parents and her brother, no sentence could ever be enough. In a single, incomprehensible night, they had lost a daughter, a sister, and 3 grandchildren, at the hands of a man they had welcomed into their own family, and trusted like a son. Their grief became public in a way few families ever have to endure. They stood in courtrooms. They spoke to reporters. They carried a loss most of us cannot begin to imagine, while the whole world watched and asked its endless questions. Through all of it, they chose to speak the names of the people they had lost, to make sure that Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were remembered not for how their lives ended, but for the love and laughter that filled them. In the face of the unthinkable, that became their quiet act of defiance. In the years since, the Watts case has become one of the most discussed crimes of its era, not because it was the most mysterious, but because it was the most familiar. There was no shadowy stranger here. No monster from a nightmare. There was a smiling young father, on a sunny street, in a house that looked exactly like yours. And that is what makes this story so genuinely hard to shake. Chris Watts did not look like danger. He looked like the neighbor who waves as he pulls out of the driveway. The coworker who holds the door. The nice, quiet man you would never, ever think twice about. It is a reminder that the most unsettling darkness does not always announce itself. Sometimes it lives behind a familiar smile, on an ordinary street, in a home that looks perfectly, reassuringly normal, right up until the moment it doesn't. So let me leave you with the question that lingers long after the headlines fade. How well do any of us really know the people behind their perfect photos? And how many quiet warning signs get smoothed over, every single day, by a familiar, reassuring smile? Tell me what you think in the comments. And subscribe, because the next case is already waiting. Because some fences are white. And some secrets live right next door.